simplifying enterprise architecture and collaboration with Abacus Modeler, is a bit of a fly through of some of the key concepts for using Abacus Modeler, some of the benefits, some of the best practices or use cases for it. And it will be more of a live demonstration, if you like, of Abacus in action. For those of you who have seen Abacus before, to see Abacus Modeler maybe in a new light potentially. And for those who are new to Abacus, just to see some of the capabilities for producing models within the tool. Avolution has been going for over 20 years now. And you can see in here that we've got offices worldwide. As a tool and as an organization, we've been rated as a leader within Gartner's Magic Quadrant, also across their CCA, and also Forrester Wave reports for EA tools. For support for over 100 different frameworks and notations. I always get picked on for the why we say over 100 for frameworks and notations and what they all are. But the main idea here is the flexibility for producing models and notations for specific audiences. So some of our users will build their own. Some will be reference architectures, maybe things like BIAN or NIST, as I was talking about earlier this morning. And then we have specific ones, so things like BPMN for business process management, and then also the more, let's say, EA-focused ones like TOGAF and Archimate. Of course, not all of these should be used in their entirety. Very often that customers will pick and choose the elements that are useful for them, not necessarily follow TOGAF completely out of the box, but have the flexibility to combine that with other notations and other frameworks. And then, of course, start building their own hybrid views to essentially build a model that's useful for the organization they work in and not a just generic model that's useful for EAs. But like I said, what I do want to do is jump into a bit more of a live demonstration here. So in Abacus Enterprise, again, for those of you who've seen this, and again, maybe just as a recap, Enterprise essentially is our collaborative environment. It's effectively a dashboarding environment, which means we have the ability to produce multiple dashboards. Each of these dashboards are then just a collection of visualizations. So these could be things like charts, lists of information, links to other resources that customers want to add in, or they could be specific models that we've built for a specific domain or line of business. Okay, so different users, different stakeholders will then likely have access to these different dashboards. What we're actually going to do today is create a new dashboard because we want to draw some diagrams today. And we're going to start from a blank dashboard just to show you an example of using Abacus Modeler, and then also just to extend it into some of the other views we have and to show you how they can be used hand in hand. Now, just before looking at the diagrams themselves, it's worth quickly diving into the visualization aspect. So dashboards are there for specific purposes. We want to build a view that's almost telling a story for our audience. And the likelihood is that it's not going to be obtained through a single view, which is where dashboards come into play so that we can build multiple views. Okay, so most organizations would use things like these charts to display specific metrics or properties. Some organizations would then use what we call these topology views to build a visual map, if you like, of all the content within their architecture. To give you an example of what that really means, if we were to produce a graph view in Abacus, we have the option in this case of choosing different viewpoints. These just act like stencils in other kind of drawing tools. It really just dictates the style of the view that we want to build. And then we also have the option of deciding where do we want this view to start from. So in this case, let's be quite specific. Let's say we're just looking at how we maybe develop and manage our products and services. So Graph View has a nice way of displaying that content to us. And this is also going to be really useful from a self-service perspective, because these graph views will then allow users to essentially drill down into specific areas. Let's say they're interested in this feature data entity, to see all of the relationships that particular component has across the model. So really useful from a, I'm going to say almost purely automated view, where we just want to see the relationships. However, and this is where Abacus Modeler comes in, it's very often that we might want to make changes to those views, and we might want to draw our own thing. There are different reasons for that. We might want to treat Abacus Enterprise as a bit more of a whiteboarding environment. Maybe we're producing multiple versions of something, so we have maybe current state and future state content. So there are different reasons why you would always want to still manually draw something versus always having an automated view. So in this case, let's go ahead and add in a new diagram into our main architecture in here. In this case, let's start off with maybe something like a process-based diagram. And let's just call this our business process 1. So these notations, as I mentioned, are going to be useful for different audiences. So I'm just going to resize my canvas in here. So this is my drawing environment. And of course, I could minimize some of these or even remove these entirely if I wanted a bit more space. In this case, I could also just maximize this to have the full screen for my creation. Now, as a user, I have 2 options. I can either see the content that other people have been creating, or as a modeler, I can actually make edits to this diagram. So there are different ways that you might want your users to interact with this data. But from all the more basic concepts, one of the first things they're likely going to want to do is add a few components. So your users might want to add in specific actors, maybe databases, data entities. In this case, you can see we've got organizations mapped as swim lanes and also departments mapped as swim lanes. So a relatively stripped back version of something like a BPMN notation. Now, again, you can fully configure this model, so you could have your own notation, but I'd recommend starting from something like BPMN, especially, of course, for business processes, because it gives you a bit more of an accelerated start and you don't have to design your own notation. So let's go ahead and add a new department onto this view. When we add departments, one of the things Abacus will do is check the model for consistencies. So we can set up specific rules in the model that dictate things like required properties. Really useful if you're creating things like applications. You want to make sure there's an owner. You might want to make sure there's a cost or some kind of criticality value. In this case, for our departments, we've set up a rule that means it has to live within a specific area in the model. In this case, within a specific region or country. So we'll just change this to South America, click OK, and then we'll have our new department that we want to create some content on. So let's say we wanted to start adding a start event. In this case, maybe there's a new request coming through. Again, there may be some required properties in here. So again, there may be some subjects that we want to create connections across the model, not just the attributes. So maybe these start events have specific connections to processes we've modeled within the organization. From here, we don't have to always use the drag and drop capabilities from the components. We can also leverage some of these dynamic connecting options. For example, this start event might eventually connect to a process. So let's go ahead and add in a new process in here. And we'll do one more for an existing process we want to add in. So there's a couple of new processes we've added. And finally, what we'll do is just connect this to the end event. Now, just before doing this, this list of objects or components you're seeing is pre-populating based on the rules in the model. So if we were using a full BPMN or TOGAF model, we aren't necessarily going to be seeing everything. Abacus is controlling what we can see and do based on the rules that we've set up. So for example, you can see we can't connect this process to a server or to a capability, for example, because it's just not one of the rules that we've set up in the model. And this is one of the best practices for using something like Abacus, which is a consistent style, but also a consistency in the models. Other drawing tools really do have their time in place and are great to start off so everyone can draw anything they like. You'll soon find there's lack of consistency and loss of standards. So the idea is that you can use something like Abacus to build those standards within the tool and then ensure there's consistency across the model. So in this case, let's say there's a new end event we want to create. So then we've created some content. The other key thing, of course, from this perspective is that all of these departments and all of these swim lanes and processes could have already existed in the model. Okay, so maybe if we were to drag this down a bit further and connect this process to a new process, as I start typing a name for this new process, ABACUS is essentially going to search the repository for existing content. And that means I can start reusing components that other people have been creating in the repository. This is another best practice for reusing content, which quite often it's the case that organizations are bringing in master data sources from other locations. So if you're connecting to something like ServiceNow, let's say, and that's mastering your list of applications, you don't necessarily want people to create new applications in ABACUS, but instead actually reuse that content. Now, we can actually build these views. And of course, like I said, all of these views will be updating the core repository. So what does that really mean? Well, let's say we also have a process over here that connects to a specific data entity. And it's actually accessing a data entity called feature. If I expand this data entity, you'll now see the add new remove existing process that this feature was connecting to. If this feature also had relationships to other areas of the model, maybe other databases, other data entities, or if this feature was potentially being accessed by a specific application, maybe let's say our CRM system, then all the content that we add onto this model will then automatically populate the graph view on the left-hand side. So this is the main benefit between these diagram-driven concepts, is just because we're creating things in what may seem like an isolated environment, they are actually being used across the entire model. And organizations can then share that content with other users, so they can then go ahead and reuse that information into other views they create, whether that's diagrams, graph views, or even just maybe charts, which display some of this data for different purposes. So all of these diagrams have a purpose, usually, of course. This isn't the whole world according to this department, but it's the snapshot that I've created for this particular reason, which in this case might be to understand which applications have access to a feature that's been generated by one of these tasks or activities, or in this case, a process. Okay, so that's one of the main benefits of using these types of diagrams, especially in a modeling environment like this. We don't need any of the complexities of, let's say, an EA tool, if you like. What we have is a much more of a seamless environment for users to create their content, and also very useful for those in a, let's say, more kind of whiteboarding environment, where they might want to build something into a future state and then elevate that in the future to be the live data set or the live content that other users can then consume. Now, it's not just constrained to process views, of course. We could create other types of views in here, but this is certainly one of the main aspects of building the data sets. The additional capabilities you'll also have is, of course, these aren't just standard drawings. All of these components will also have these specific attributes behind the scenes. So if we wanted to change the criticality of CRM, if we wanted to change its lifecycle stage, all of these types of attributes can still be edited directly from these diagrams, because like I said, they are live views with live data sets. They're not just boxes and lines on a diagram. They have context behind them, both the components and the connections. Okay, so all the connections will also have their own attributes in terms of how these things are being modeled across the repository. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is when we actually draw our diagrams, and for this is, for those of you who are aware of like our Blue Peter moment of here's one we've made earlier, there are different layouts that you might want to apply. So let's say we've spent some time building specific views. Maybe we've got something like a subject area view of some of the data entities. maybe capabilities and their access to applications and where they're hosted. These arguably are relatively structured anyway. But what you can actually start doing through these modeling capabilities is trying different layout styles. So you can play around with these. Some are more appropriate for specific views, depending on the type of content you're producing. But certainly for this view, I imagine, we'll just try this, some kind of hierarchy view, there we go, will actually help structure that data, maybe in a more usable or readable way. So even if we happen to have all of this content, which is relatively messy on these views, we can always come back to the layout options and try the layouts again. So Abacus can retrofit this content around your diagrams. Again, really useful if you're in a position where you are just building something very quickly. You're not too worried about the style that's being used, especially maybe in this case. We might want to try different layout methods just to see which one actually works best. So organic might give us more of a structured approach to this data set, specifically for something like these ERD type of views. Certainly tree style layouts tend to work quite well for structuring that information. And again, you don't have to save these views, of course. I could always undo all of my changes so that users are just left with the original views in here already. So those are the key modeling concepts. Certainly best practices for this would be to use components and connections that may already exist in the model so we can promote reuse of content. Start using these diagramming capabilities as whiteboarding environments, where you want users to make some quick changes to existing diagrams in here, or maybe even just edit their own views very quickly. It's much easier than having arguably a separate tool with no context to this data. Also avoids you having to maybe go into Abacus Studio to make some other changes. So treat Modeler, like we've mentioned, as a key area for your users to contribute, to collaborate on these data sets. They're effectively building these views for your stakeholders. And of course, with the ability to contribute in this relatively seamless way versus maybe using something like Visio, then having to import and map that to your existing data sets, this provides much more of a self-service environment for them to go through those processes. Now, what you've seen so far, of course, is some relatively standard notational context we have within the Avolution framework. Of course, if you were using Archimate, you'd have the Archimate notation in here. If you were building cloud architectures, you'd have access to AWS, Azure, and Google Cloud notation icons. So all of that's going to be available out of the box. So even your cloud architects can come in, use the Azure library, build their models, and then submit that to the model for feedback from your users. Hopefully in more of a single source of truth, a single repository that everyone feels that they can then contribute to. Like I mentioned, today was just going to be a quick short session on Modeler. Of course, there are some more capabilities in here that I'd highly encourage you to reach out to your team members and account managers to find out more information on how you can utilize these, let's say, best practices within your organization, some tips and tricks from the team that we can actually deploy as well. But I encourage you to take a look through. And with the time we have remaining, I feel like we can probably open to a Q&A if there are any questions that come in.
Yeah, there are some questions, Andrew. Yeah. So okay. Shall I read the first one out?
Yeah, sure.
Does nesting these objects within the department's objects imply that there is an existing relationship, i.e. is it a hidden connection?
Yeah, great question. So I'll jump back to a similar view. Unfortunately, I'd removed the one I just created. So yes, you can see in here, we have this hierarchy. So we have maybe an organization with actors or departments, capabilities, processes, tasks, and applications. It's not always an indication that these have a relationship behind the scenes. There are two forms that these objects can take. They can be connected through maybe a hierarchy. And hierarchies are typically maybe organizational or capability process models versus floating components. So the reason we have these applications on here is purely from a visual perspective. If we want to show these connections to the activities or processes, this intranet application will exist somewhere else in the model. It doesn't necessarily exist under this recruit, source, and select employees grouping, but we're displaying it in here as a floating component rather than having it sit outside these boxes or making it much more complicated and having a separate grouping and below. So it doesn't always indicate a natural relationship or hierarchy, but they can be used as nesting hierarchies if you wanted them to be. Hopefully that was clear enough.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you for that, Andrew. Okay, another question. What types of diagram can we create? Is it limited to mainly business processes? Well, I think you probably did give other examples, but we are right now looking at a process diagram. But are there other examples you'd want to share?
Yeah, definitely. So, if we were thinking of things like very detailed views, we might be looking at application interface diagrams, building API and microservices diagrams. This one is pretty detailed. We have a whole bunch of different notations on here, showing which technologies this application requires, what its criticality is, protocols between different applications. But your diagrams can really span across the entire model. All the way from kind of solution architecture views, slices through the entire architecture, to bespoke views like these application views, the business-oriented views like capabilities and processes, all the way up to maybe strategic content, maybe using something like BMM or BMC to produce more strategic views. So you're not limited in this space, and all of this notation is also fully customizable. So if you have your own styles that you want to use, those can be deployed in ABACUS as well.
And someone's asked if you could actually show adding a floating component.
Yeah, so one of the ideas behind using these modeling capabilities, and while I'm in this view, I'll click edit, is when we start adding components to this view, the styles we've applied. So for example, each of these components in here in terms of the icons and notations are initially set in ABACUS Studio. So that's one of the other benefits of using Modeler, is that you can build a lens or a viewpoint or a standard that people can use. And then of course they have to adhere to that standard. Then on each of these components, we can then decide to make those floating in Studio as part of that stencil. Or as we move these around, we'll have the option to change their parent. So for example, if I was to use knowledge management out of here, you'll see the hierarchy will potentially change behind the scenes as well. So it's checking for any potential hierarchy changes. And that means we can make these either floating or non-floating using those Studio stencils as well.
Cool. Now that's similar, I think, in some ways to another question. If you add a component to a drawing that already exists, will it also import the relationships to other components, or are they already in the drawing?
Yep, sure. So for those of you who've already used Studio, that is an option that will pop up. We've not replicated all the feature sets from Studio into ABACUS Enterprise modeling capabilities. There's potential that we will in the future. There's certainly some work we're doing to expand the capabilities of the modeling environment. But one of the key things we're trying to focus on at the beginning is how do we make it as seamless as possible? So if you were to add components into this view, the first thing is I can search the repository for existing content and add that to the view, of course. If I was creating connections between components, it will always reuse existing connections if there are any before creating new ones. Because, for example, you might not necessarily know there's a connection between two things yet. But in the future, of course, we'd then like to introduce more of the capabilities around dragging a capability and it automatically having all of those relationships. I would say in the meantime, this is where the entirety of the dashboarding environments come into play, utilizing something like graph views so that we don't always have to draw things manually. We can always deep dive into one of these areas to see all the relationships. So like usual for these modeling capabilities, I'd likely recommend using them in conjunction with some of the other views on here as well.
So we had a question which was asking, is there a library of these dashboard components that we can reference? Certainly you've given a good example of all the, within this demo project, all the samples that are there.
Yeah, so the default ones include the standard visualizations. So these are the different charts and topology views I mentioned. And then the ability to add existing content that you might have been creating in the repository. or of course, completely new content. So that includes things like your diagrams, your catalogs, and your matrices. So all of those types of feeds can be added in. The benefit of having something like ABACUS Enterprise in general is that we could also build custom visualizations. And you might want to create things like landing pages. So a lot of customers will start with landing pages and build their own navigation links to other views within the model or to other resources or sources of content. So there are a few things that you can actually add already out of the box, but we hope to expand obviously on some of the visualization concepts in the future here as well.
Cool. Someone's asked about exporting or taking copies into PowerPoint.
Yep, sure. So quite often is the case that just because we're in ABACUS Enterprise and we want to encourage people to come into these views, it might not always be the case that they have access or we want to give them access. So specifically, of course, for things like diagrams, if you wanted to export these out, you can just export these as image formats and then reuse these in things like PowerPoint presentations or slides. The other thing I'd likely recommend outside of PowerPoint, so let's say you're using something like Microsoft Teams or Confluence sites, is just embedding something like ABACUS Enterprise. It doesn't have to be entire dashboards. It could just be a single view or a single list of content. And embedding that in those areas, again, just helps the whole collaborative nature of people contributing to those data sets in an environment that they're familiar with. So we might want to hide all of these blue bar options at the top. It just looks like a diagram in Confluence, yet they will still have the ability to come in and make those edits live in that data set without even thinking that they're using anything different to maybe Visio Online or Excel Online. Doesn't have to come across like it's an EA tool to some respect, but it means you can start embedding those. But yes, for PowerPoint, usually recommend exporting these to different image formats or exporting in time models to things like PDF reports if necessary.
Cool. I think in the course of answering that, you just touched on this one last question that we've got here about can other users or teams edit our diagrams? You know, the way that you could actually make access to this based upon different users' rights.
Yeah, so there's two parts to that. So the first is the permissions model. So all of these dashboards have specific permissions in place that only certain groups of users have access to the entire dashboard. The permissions also work down to the diagram level, to the component properties level even. So you can even say you have access to the CRM application, but you can't see its cost. So that's the first thing. Permissions will allow you to either hide some of these diagrams from users or just make them read-only. But that does also fall into the second type, which is the type of user you are within ABACUS Enterprise. So if you're a read-only user, you will only have access to see this content. You'll still have access to filter, to drill down, to maybe even see the details of each of these applications or processes or capabilities. But it's only the modeler users who have access to this edit option. So this is the view that most read-only users would see. As an editor, I have an additional option at the top to then access the options to create content and change some of that content.
Cool. Well, while I've been talking, Andrew, you had two more questions come in. I think we have got time for those. The first, can you show an example of filtering objects in a diagram depending on a property?
Yeah, sure. So we can take this view here, actually. So let's say we have an application list. And arguably, I can just tidy this up a little bit just to make this a bit more obvious. So let's say we have an application diagram. We have a list of applications. Each of these applications have specific attributes on them. So whether we want to retire them or how critical they are. And in this list, we can see all those apps. So let's say I was just interested in those we were going to retire. Then these diagrams will then filter to only show those applications with the status of retire. This becomes really useful when you're applying things like end of life dates, maybe filter to only show everything that would be on my application landscape in 6 months or 12 months or 2 years. Also really useful to combine this with other filters, because I might also want to be quite specific and say, well, everything that's retiring and everything that's highly critical. In this case, I'm left with one application that's highly critical to the organization, but our recommendation is to actually retire this application. Now, these diagrams are going to be useful again for multi-filters. So I want to filter by drilling down to specific regions or countries, filtering by using different charts. This is just an example of filtering using one of the catalogs.
Cool. Okay. Thank you, Andrew.
No
and indeed, then this last question, which probably could have linked it with the previous one, is there a way in which you're able to check the occurrences of an object? And how would you ensure that governed objects are locked, by keeping them in some library for future reuse?
Just repeat that again. Check the
occurrences of an object.
Sure. So when we're actually producing content in Abacus, one of the areas that we might want to take focus on, particularly at the start, is where that's been produced. So we might want to build things like a future state, current state, maybe phases of a project. That's one of the main things that we might want to do. The other thing is on each of these, well, talk about applications because we're on the application dashboard. Each of these applications will likely have maybe a specific status or stage. And they might also have specific modified by dates and modified by users. So we can check to see if the content we're using is the correct content. This becomes quite useful for things like technology landscapes. If your users are creating new solutions and they require specific technologies to be used for that solution, one of the things you're going to want to do is highlight on those technologies, whether they are up for retirement, or for more typical organizations, we'd use a status like approved or denied or recommended, because that's going to be useful for then understanding, as soon as I drag something onto a canvas, if it already has these colored markers that have been set up to show whether something is approved or denied, then I know immediately that I probably shouldn't be using that technology. So it's a great way of identifying stuff that you shouldn't be using based on the recommendations the organization's making, and stuff that you maybe should use as a recommended solution instead. So there's a few different ways of doing that. You might just want to filter and use the content from the list, or rely on some of the annotations in here to show you what those values actually are.
Cool. Excellent. Okay, Andrew. Well, thank you. And that is then all of the questions that we've had. Actually, I was looking to see if anyone had asked anything about the way in which Modeler is supplied. I mean, and indeed, it was certainly on my mind to sort of let people know that Modeler seats are typically included within the bundles that we most often supply now, the Essentials bundle and the Premium bundle. So sometimes there's even the case that customers have got the option to be using this and they may not have started doing so. But obviously, it's another seat that can be purchased and added to an existing license, assuming you've got Enterprise, of course. I think it works out about half the price of a full studio user. Now, sorry, I just saw that one other question had come in.
Yeah, sure.
This is a difficult one to work out. On platform service column, how the little color box was set up for the items.
Yeah, sure. So this is usually a setting that we might have applied in Abacus Studio, where we're color coding this particular column according to the status of that particular technology. So this catalog may have been created in Studio and then it's been displayed in Enterprise. There's still changes that we can make in Enterprise. So on the platform services column, we might have used a specific color coding in here for the recommendation. Arguably, we would like to use the recommendation values themselves so that we can actually fully control the color per value. So that's usually how we'd set the color settings. And like I said, I'm in Enterprise, I can make those changes. So I can actually do that on the fly here as well. So I can set the color coding in here according to that recommendation property for that particular platform service. So in this case, I might want to be very specific and say, actually, anything retain, I agree in this case, probably should be something like a green. And I really want to make it very obvious that anything that's up for retirement should be in red. And it makes it much easier then for users to identify those things at a glance, rather than having to dive into a separate list of technologies or create something first and then figure out if it has that status. I can immediately see that I clearly should stop using Microsoft Access because end of support, or in this case, maybe end of life, was quite a while ago. So something to consider when I'm starting to produce my solutions is to avoid some of these technologies. But like I said, we can control all those settings in here directly from this enterprise view.
Excellent. Okay, Andrew, well, thank you for that. Crikey, one more question has snuck in just as we were wrapping up there, but I think it's a quick one. Does ABACUS connect with other applications? I'll let you answer that, Andrew. Yes.
Yeah, sure. So yes, in a few different ways. If you wanted to connect to something like SharePoint lists, Visio files, Technopedia, ServiceNow, Google Sheets, Excel, those kinds of integrations are available out of the box. For more bespoke integrations, you might want to leverage something like the REST API in ABACUS, or even the .NET API within ABACUS Studio itself. Both of those options will allow you to then connect to any other system that has an open API. You'll usually find more detailed guidance on the full integration documentation that we have. And very likely on our YouTube channel, you'll find a few sessions where we've covered integrating to things like Jira, for example. And we also have, probably goes without saying, integrations to other EA tools that people might want to migrate from, like an exporter from Sparks, an Archimate Exchange file format that we support. So that means easy exports and imports from stuff like Archie, for example. There's a whole host of integrations. So the full integration guide will hopefully cover all of that, but hopefully that gives you a snippet of some useful integrations, the more common ones.